Good morning, and welcome to another Seize the Day. Today is Monday, December the 5th, and we get to spend it again with one another. So that's a plus. Trust you guys are waking up feeling refreshed, ready to begin a new day, and excited about the week. This week, a number of really great things happening at Bethany. Tonight is our first Monday for men, and I get an opportunity to speak to them. And later on the week, on on the 9th and 10th, we are going to have a drive-through Christmas celebration. The whole church is going to be decorated outside. We've got about 40,000 lights that are going to be on display. We usually have just hundreds and hundreds of cars that come filled with kids and everyone just to begin this whole new season of Christmas. And then this year we're inviting everyone inside, and we're going to have an after party. So people could come in, there's going to be all kinds of refreshments. And so we're really looking forward to making everyone feel welcome. So we're in the middle of a series now for Advent. And this series we've entitled God's People Living Generously. So this is the second week in Advent. We began with a look at the incarnation, and we looked at it as a model of generosity. We saw that it begins with the heart of God the Father, right? God so loved the world that he gave. And what he gave was his most cherished possession. He gave his son, Jesus. Jesus comes into the world, and it says that he has come that you and I might receive this life abundant. And I love the text that we mentioned from John 13:1, where it says, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to be with the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he showed them the full extent of that love. And how that relates to this incarnation is like Jesus came knowing full well what was before him. Jesus would mention this to his disciples, right? He would come and begin to speak to them about what this kingdom of heaven was all about. He would demonstrate that in words, and he would demonstrate that in actions. But there's going to be a turning point. And towards the end of chapter 16 in Matthew, what we see is Jesus begins to speak to them about his coming, crucifixion. And it doesn't sit well with the disciples. They really don't know what to make of that. And it becomes this opportunity for the Lord to really begin to speak into them about what this full role of the Messiah was going to accomplish. And so for you and for me, it's enough to know that in this ladder of generosity, right, this model, God the Father gave his most treasured possession. Jesus gives his life. Mary gave her future. Joseph gave his reputation. The shepherds gave of their time. The Magi gave of their money. All of which shows that the implications of the incarnation required all of us to engage on multiple levels. And so we are now into this study, and we began with a look at a text in Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 9. It is the story of the unjust steward. And we've learned some things. We're going to be in this particular parable for a couple of weeks. The interesting thing about this parable, it's probably one of the hardest to interpret, but what it does is Jesus presents this parable, and then he offers a running commentary on the implications of this parable. And rather than just explaining the parable itself, Jesus uses the parable and then uses that to really begin to lay a foundation for its application. And so it's going to take us a couple of weeks to run through all of the insights that Jesus is bringing. And so I'd like to begin today by just inviting you to turn to Luke chapter 16, and let's take a look at this passage together. Before we do, as you're finding it in your Bibles, I want to tell you a funny little story. There was a man in a hot air balloon, and he realized he was lost. So he reduces his altitude, and he spots a man down below. And as he descended a bit more, he began to shout. He said, excuse me, can you help me? He says, I promised a friend that I would meet him an hour ago, but I really don't know where I am. The man below looked up and without a moment's hesitation says, well, sir, you're in a hot air balloon hovering approximately 30 feet above the ground. You're between 40 and 41 degrees north latitude and between 59 and 60 degrees west longitude. And the balloonist looked down at this man and shaking his head, he says, you must be an engineer. And the man replied, he says, how'd you know? And the balloonist says, well, everything you told me is technically correct, but I have no idea what to make of your information. And the fact is, I'm still lost. Frankly, you've not been much help at all. If anything, you've delayed my trip. Well, the man responded, he says, let me guess, you must be in management. And the balloonist says, I am. He says, how'd you know? He says, well, you don't know where you are or where you're going. You've risen to where you are due to a large quantity of hot air. You made a promise which you have no idea how to keep, and you expect people beneath you to solve your problems. The fact is, you're in exactly the same position you were before we met, but now somehow it's my fault. That's a pretty funny little story. You know, it really is, though, hard to assume responsibility for one's actions, isn't it? It's difficult to take that look in the mirror and make those necessary changes. I mean, it's a whole lot easier to apportion blame to others. If they had done this, if they didn't do that, if only this would have happened or didn't happen. See, like the balloonist, we find ourselves sometimes lost and adrift, you know, and it's just like scrambling to get our bearings. How often do you find yourself in need of real direction? And yet, when direction is sometimes given, do we really grasp it? I think about that often when it comes to Jesus. I think Jesus is constantly giving us direction, but either we miss it or we fail to apply it, and we can trip over the same encumbrances and obstacles in one's life. Listen, I think that's how sometimes it is that we hear the words of Jesus. So I want to read a passage to you, and I want to test our sense of hearing. I want us to really get it, because if we get this, it has far-reaching implications for a trajectory of one's life. As so many of Jesus' teaching, they're meant to enhance our life, to give us a more full life, to keep us from being held prisoner to our own passions or our own ambitions. It keeps us from getting stuck because of the brokenness that we find in the world around us. Now, Jesus' words, he says, if we apply them, if we put them into practice, it not only makes our house built on a solid foundation, weathering the storms that life will bring, but he's also telling us that we will experience an abundant life, a full life. So, are you up for this challenge? It's all about this call to live life generously. All right, so Luke chapter 16. Jesus tells his disciples there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and he asked him, what is this that I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer. The manager said to himself, What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig. And I'm ashamed to beg. And then it's as if this little light goes on in his head, and he says, oh, I know what I'll do. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. So he called in each one of his master's debtors, and he asked the first, how much do you owe my master? 800 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 400. And then he asked the second, how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat, he told him. Well, take your bill and make it 800. Now, listen to what it says in verse 8. It says, the master commended the dishonest manager because he acted shrewdly. And then Jesus adds this commentary. He says, for the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. Now, when you hear that, does it sink in? Did the master actually commend the dishonest manager? Like, why would he do that? He basically just ripped him off. There's a couple of things, though, that, I want to talk to you about this morning. So there's this rich guy, and he has a manager. Now, this manager is wasting his possessions. Now, it seems that wasting, that word is used in the same context of when the prodigal son took all of his father's money, right? And where do we read that? That's in Luke chapter 15, right? So in Luke chapter 15, remember, this story has just finished being told. And Jesus talks about this prodigal who took the inheritance that he received from his father, and he wasted that money in riotous living, right? So that same idea then is brought into this next parable about this manager wasting it. And so how do you think he wasted his servant's money? He probably found a way to make his life much better, don't you think? Now, think about this too. Have you ever thought for a moment, like when you read the parable and it says, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 800 gallons of olive oil. Is that a lot? Is that a little? It was interesting. I mean, I have no context really to understand what kind of yield olives would produce. But would it surprise you if I told you that it would take over 150 olive trees to produce that much oil? And we're not told if this manager has other debtors too. He just went to a few. But if you have 150 olive trees and somebody's owing you 1,000 gallons, you probably have much more than that. And it's the same thing with the wheat. It would take hundreds of acres to produce that much wheat. So all of which is to underscore that this is a rich man, but yet his possessions are being squandered by his manager. And so when the manager finds out, it costs this manager his job. So when you get to verse 8, aren't you taken back a little bit? Because everything that it seems that this manager is doing is to improve his situation. One of the things that you notice here is there's this crisis that has developed. This man has developed a poor reputation. He says, he called him in. He says, what is this I hear about you, in verse 2? So word has gone out on the street about this guy. And eventually it has wound up coming back to the owner, to the rich man, right? And that crisis is now exposed. It says, you can no longer be my manager. So with that crisis exposed, notice then now this unjust manager here, right? He has to find a way, because he begins to think through his own personal inventory. And he says, what am I going to do? He says, my job is going away. And then he thinks, you know what? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm too proud to beg. And he says, so I think I know what I'll do. So that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. Do you notice he's coming up with a strategy on how to enhance his position? It's all about finding a way for him to be welcomed into other people's homes so that they would feel obligated towards him and his life would be easier, even though he no longer is manager. So people will take care of him. So his whole motivation in this crisis is not to somehow repent and become a better manager. He's just looking at a way to manage this crisis in a way that it enhances his position. And so what's the strategy? Well, the strategy is to engage the master's debtors, and at the expense of the rich man, enhance his position. So he's saying, hey, you owe 800, write down, make it 400. That's a 50% discount. Or how about you owe 1,000 bushels a week, make it 800, 20% right off the top. And so he executes, he goes out, all this stuff happens. Why? Because I don't want you to lose sight of this. He wants to enhance his own position. Not strong enough to dig, too proud to beg. What am I going to do? I lost my job. And so he finds a clever way to ingratiate himself with people. Now, here's the twist. It says the manager is commended for the cleverness he brought to remedying his situation. He had a problem, and he sought a solution. Now, notice here that what is being commended is not the method, right? His dishonesty is not being commended. What is being commended, though, is how he was shrewd enough, right, he was shrewd enough to engage his master's debtors in a way that would guarantee that he would have a soft landing. So we're not the master isn't commending the lying, the deceit, all that. What he is saying here is, here's a guy who found a way to remedy a situation. Now, you notice he doesn't get his job back. He's not saying, hey, that was really good. Maybe you could use those same skills for me. No. Here, what's being commended is his shrewdness. He was clever enough to figure out a way for himself. But we don't know what would come of that. But here is one of those kinds of parables that this is a very real world kind of scenario, isn't it? Where people are working the system so that it benefits themselves. How they come alongside and they politic in a way that it just makes it easier. And those who are have a heightened sense of justice, right? Of right and wrong. They sit there and they're taken back. They're like, boy, that's so unfair. But we live in a world that's like this, right? And so every day we're living in a world that has these kinds of upside down kinds of principles. And so it is certainly true that sometimes people, they're commended for their shrewdness, and in a weird way they it's like reading a story about how someone committed a theft, and they make movies about it, about how clever that was. Yeah, but you realize it was wrong. And what this guy was doing was wrong, but why did he do it? Well, remember, Jesus describes this manager as dishonest and places him squarely within the category of the people of this world, as opposed to the people of the light. Do you catch that? Look what it says in verse 8. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world, speaking of the dishonest manager, right, are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. So you notice there is now introduced into this parable a contrast. There is the people of the world, and there are the people of the light. And their own kind has everything to do with these resources that the dishonest manager is becoming more and more shrewd about. Unfortunate that we refrain from using words like shrewd or clever to describe believers. Childlike has come to mean naive, right? However, when you're thinking well, when you're being astute, shrewd, ingenious, it could also be a kingdom quality, right? Like, think about this. Jesus just says that this manager was dishonest, placed him squarely in the category of the people of this world. But then he makes this criticism. He says, for the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than the people of the light. So what do we learn from this story? Well, one of the first applications that you see here is in verse 9. He says, I tell you, use worldly wealth, right? So now, if you go back to that verse 8, and it says, the people of this world, right, are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind. So here, we're talking about now, Jesus says, I want you to use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. So the question then is, how are we to manage our resources in a way that's appropriate to life in the kingdom? And so it starts off with this worldly wealth. It talks about gaining friends. It talks about being welcomed into eternal dwellings. What does this parable then teach us about this? Well, that's what we're going to spend our time this week looking at. And I want you to read over this parable again and recognize that the main point of this parable is what Jesus is saying in verses 8 and 9. That the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. So I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. There's a lot to unpack in this, and as you go through this this chapter, there's so much that I think could really speak into our life, especially during a season of Christmas that's always characterized by a season of giving and celebrations. And here, God just wants to make sure that we're being shrewd as his managers. And living generously is a great way to demonstrate that. So put on your thinking caps, think a little bit more about this parable, and we're going to spend some time talking about it in this week. So, my friends, Go out, seize the day. Let this word just begin to germinate in your mind. And watch, ask, pray to see what God would give you this week that might just help us to live life more fully. And again, as always, I hope you recognize that we serve a God who is good all the time. My friends, Lord willing, looking forward to spending some more time with you again tomorrow. And until then, Lord bless you. So glad to be a part of this community.